Hey guys, tonight we're slipping deep into the darkness of a castle where silence echoes louder than the executioner's whip. Imagine this, a stone fortress standing alone atop a Hungarian hill, candlelight flickering in the windows, but behind those walls, young girls keep vanishing one by one, never to return. And the one behind it all, she didn't hide. She smiled, because she believed she had discovered the secret to eternal youth. And trust me, her skincare routine could kill you. Literally. No one called her queen, but the power, the wealth, and the trust the poor placed in her were stronger than any crown. Tonight's story is not for the faint of heart. And no, you wouldn't survive if you tried this beauty ritual at home. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're watching this video at midnight, leave a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. I always love imagining you lying in the dark, headphones in, and I'm the dreamy voice beside your pillow. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie still. The lights are soft. No more traffic sounds. Only my voice. And one question. What drives a woman to kill over 600 young girls just to bathe in their blood? You heard that right. Not for sacrifice, not for power, but for skincare. We're in 16th century Hungary. Picture a noble family with land, soldiers, and blood ties to royalty, but also infamous for a taste for torture. Yes, not for raising hunting dogs or collecting art, but for tying people up and inventing new ways to prolong their pain. That family, as you may know, is the Bathories. And your main character tonight, Elizabeth Bathory, is the black rose blooming in this garden of thorns. You're born into silk and gold, fed from silver, sleeping on velvet. But all around you are screams from the dungeons, public executions as casual entertainment. While other kids your age are playing hopscotch, young Elizabeth is studying the expression of the dying, as if trying to improve the process. Then, at age 11, you're betrothed to a man famous for cruelty on the battlefield, Ferenc Endasti. They call him the Black Knight. Doesn't exactly scream husband material, but you know what? Some historians argue that Elizabeth learned her first torture techniques from this very war hero heartthrob. Some couples share recipes. This one exchanged techniques on how to flay skin without spilling too much blood. Who says couples shouldn't share hobbies? When Ferenc dies, Elizabeth is 44, beautiful, wealthy, and unchecked. And you know what happens when you give absolute power to someone mentally unstable. Welcome to the world's first beauty castle. Elizabeth begins recruiting, not makeup artists, but peasant girls, aged 12 to 18, promised light work, good pay, room and board. You know the type of ad. Some things never change. They arrived. They never left. The castle stood high on a hill, surrounded by forest, guarded by soldiers, and feared by villagers too afraid to whisper. Inside, you wouldn't find powders or oils. Instead, custom-designed torture chambers where every tool was a bizarre beauty device. Elizabeth believed young blood softened the skin. After slapping a maid one day, she noticed the blood on her hand made her skin smoother. And from that moment, instead of serum, she used victims. This was, in a way, the medieval version of all-natural skincare. But do you know what's even more bizarre? She kept meticulous records, like a scientist, noting age, hometown, reaction to torture, blood freshness, and post-use effects. One has to wonder, if social media existed back then, Elizabeth would have had a skincare review channel titled 3 Simple Street Eps to Glowing Skin. Step 1. Find a victim. Historians still debate where the myth ends and the truth begins. Some say she was the target of a political smear campaign. Others insist the evidence is undeniable. But one thing is nearly certain. She had a full-blown protection network, from servants and nobles to priests. And here's the part, more chilling than the blood. For over 20 years, almost no one did a thing. Why? Because her status outweighed the pain of nameless girls. Just like now, when the rich break rules and quietly vanish from the headlines. Some things really don't change. Now, don't tense up, breathe. The story isn't over, but let the hum of your fan ease your mind for a moment. Still with me? Good, because from here on out, the darkness only deepens. And Elizabeth, behind that smooth, wrinkleless skin, will show you what happens when beauty becomes possessed by immortality. Picture this. You're a poor girl in the Hungarian countryside, from a large family, waking up to the sound of hunger and falling asleep with dreams of a better life. One day, people from the castle arrive, clean cloaks, kind voices, warm smiles. They say, "The lady of the castle needs maids, good pay, clothes to wear, meat to eat every day." To your family, that offer sounds like a message from heaven. You nod, and your mother even walks you to the edge of the village. She might even cry tears of joy. She believes her daughter is about to change her life. And then, you disappear. No one asks, no one dares to. Because the one who took you wore noble clothes, rode a horse, had guards, and you were just a peasant girl. Elizabeth created a recruitment system so clever, it didn't need violence, only hope. Her people went village by village, market to market, using sweet words. Sometimes they gave money to parents as a thank you, sometimes a beautiful dress, or a pouch of rare seeds. You know, when people are hungry, anything can become currency. What's terrifying is this: no one was forced. Every girl came to the castle willingly. From the outside, everything looked proper. Clean buildings, kitchens filled with the smell of stew, bedrooms with herb-scented sheets. But step into the basement and everything changed. Elizabeth was meticulous. She never killed quickly. First came the assessment. A few days of observation, a few trial shifts. To see who was obedient, who was stubborn, who was strong, who was just young enough. Age her. Once she made her choice, she ordered them to her private chamber. Don't picture a sitting room. It was where she began her experiments, methods you won't find in medical texts, but that will haunt you for a long time. Historians still debate the true number of victims. Some say 80. Others record over 650. The discrepancy comes from how tidy Elizabeth was. The bodies were dealt with immediately after each skincare session. Sometimes buried in the yard. Sometimes dumped into the river. Sometimes left for the wolves in the forest to take care of. She knew this. No body, no crime. And what chills you more than blood is this: the ones who helped her weren't demons. They were maids, older women, some of whom were once victims themselves, but out of fear, in exchange for food or to be spared, became accomplices. Some people truly believed Elizabeth was chosen by God, that virgin blood could purify sin, that she was the embodiment of purity while standing in a blood-soaked bath. Think about it. If dozens of people all believe that something is normal, who's left to recognize the wrong? A sad truth is this: when evil is legitimized by power and silence, it becomes ritual. And Elizabeth created an entire beauty ritual soaked in blood, performed again and again as if it were just part of noble life. Sometimes, the girls were kept longer, not out of favor, but because they were more effective. Those girls would be better fed, better cared for, only to be prepared for the next use. And do you know the most ironic part? Elizabeth didn't see herself as a monster. She saw herself as a powerful woman, defying nature, resisting time. She didn't cackle wickedly. She looked in the mirror. She applied cream. She asked, "How does my skin look today?" Her mirrors were custom made, with silver layering that concealed wrinkles. The maids were trained to flatter. "You look so youthful. No one would guess your age. Your skin glows like the autumn moon." The same phrases you still hear in modern beauty ads. One time, a maid accidentally said, "You look a little tired today." That same night, she vanished. No one asked, because everyone understood. In that castle, survival meant silence. But do you hear it? The first crack in the wall of power. Because Elizabeth made a mistake, she started recruiting from the lower nobility. Girls with ties to lords. Girls not so easy to silence. And you know how it goes. When the victim has connections, the law suddenly finds its voice. Now picture this. A large stone room. Candlelight flickering yellow against the vaulted ceiling. In the center, a custom-forged iron tub. Deep, sturdy, cold. But what's inside isn't hot water nor goat's milk. It's blood, human blood. Elizabeth didn't spill blood randomly. She believed it had to be fresh, had to be warm, for maximum effect. Like how your skincare bottle says, use immediately after opening. For Elizabeth, the opening was a freshly cut vein. The girls were hung upside down, head down, feet up, right above the tub, and the blood would flow, slowly, thick and dark, merging with what Elizabeth called her rejuvenation ritual. She would sink into it, slowly, gently, each movement like a mournful dance in a twisted opera. And it didn't stop there. After the bath, she would step out, and here's the part where you might want to breathe deeply, because it's both grotesque and almost sacred in the way she performed it. Elizabeth would take the remaining blood, sometimes drop by drop, and apply it to her face, her neck, her hands, the most visible places. She called it her night mask. Sometimes she'd use a clean cloth to soak up the blood and press it to her cheeks. Sometimes she'd mix it with herbs or red wine to create a thick crimson paste and smear it on dry patches of skin. She would stand before the mirror, smiling, watching it all absorb. You might think of modern skincare ads, but in that stone room, there were no studio lights. Only the sound of blood dripping onto the floor, the crackling fire, and the wild eyes of a woman trying to cheat time. The intriguing question is, did it actually work? Historians still debate it. Some believe Elizabeth truly maintained a youthful appearance longer than most, or at least in her own eyes and in the eyes of those forced to praise her. Maybe human blood contains protein, iron, and warmth. Or maybe it was all just a delusion, sustained by organized madness. Anyway, you know the feeling when you buy an expensive skincare product and you convince yourself it must work because you spent too much on it? Elizabeth paid in human blood. Of course, she wanted to see results, whether they were real or imagined. There was a time she commissioned a mirror maker to craft a special mirror, one that didn't reflect light normally, but made her skin appear brighter, smoother. You could call it a medieval filter. And every night after the blood ritual, she'd stand there, smiling in satisfaction. Here's a lesser-known detail. Elizabeth had beauty notebooks, not actual books, but handwritten records kept by her maids. They included notes like, blood from victims aged 13. 14 gives a softer texture. Bath should be taken immediately after collection. Do not leave overnight. As if you were reading directions on a vitamin C serum. And if you're wondering, did anyone ever try to stop her? The answer is yes, but they vanished. A maid who spilled blood, a priest who asked the wrong question, a guard who saw something he shouldn't have, and then no one ever saw them again. But you know what? The most chilling thing isn't the blood or even the rituals. It's how Elizabeth described it all, as life maintenance. Not murder, but prolonging youth. You see, language can disguise anything, even madness. Each night, she didn't just fall asleep with a facial mask, but with a whisper in her head. I will not grow old, never. 1. And as you lie there, blanket pulled a little tighter, eyes half closed, ask yourself, where is the limit to the desire for beauty? And if the world kept praising you for being forever young, how far would you go to keep hearing it? Elizabeth Bathe may top the list of Europe's most brutal legends, but if you think people had no idea what was happening, you'd be wrong. The truth is, everyone knew a little. They just didn't want to be the first to speak. She killed within her own castle, amid cries rising from the dungeons, amid carts hauling bodies away in the night. The guards stayed silent. The maids said nothing. The villagers looked away. Because you know, in a world where power is the law, speaking out is signing your own sentence. But then, as every story turns, Elizabeth made the greatest mistake of her life. She expanded her pool of victims, no longer just peasant girls, but noble daughters, girls from families with wealth, with power, and with voices. Some noble young ladies were invited to the castle under the pretense of learning etiquette, refining virtue. Their families were thrilled at first. Who wouldn't be if their daughter were personally sponsored by a renowned countess? But then, the girls didn't return. At first, it was just a whisper. My daughter last wrote me a week ago. Then small questions. Didn't the countess seem a little strange? And then the whisper spread like cracks on thin ice. Eventually, a few brave families, or at least powerful enough, sent letters to the royal court, reaching the ears of King Matthias II. He, a distant relative of Elizabeth, at first turned a blind eye. But as the number of letters grew, and especially when the missing bore the surnames of families seated at court, he could no longer ignore it. At the end of 1610, the king sent the one man he trusted most, and who was no less complicated to investigate. Count Georgi Thurs, Elizabeth's cousin, Can you imagine sending a cousin to investigate another cousin, but hoping he finds nothing? Because if he does, the court would face a scandal entangling the royal family, the church, and the local nobility. Sounds like a just-for-show investigation, doesn't it? But unfortunately for Elizabeth, Thurs was a man with a conscience. And when he arrived at Chrade Castle, in present-day Slovakia, there was no turning back. On the night of the 29th of December, 1610, Thurs and a group of armed soldiers stormed the castle. They didn't knock. They didn't wait for an invitation. And what they saw was something even battle-hardened warriors would never forget. They saw bodies, blood still flowing, girls tied up, cut open, hung upside down. A few still alive, barely, disfigured, no longer themselves. Torture instruments scattered across the floor, blood staining the stones. And Elizabeth, standing in the center, didn't look panicked. She simply sighed, as if someone had interrupted her skincare routine. One of the soldiers later recalled that Elizabeth didn't deny anything. She simply asked, "Is there a law that says a lady can't take care of her appearance?" Capturing her was one thing. Putting her on trial was another. Because, as you know, a public trial for someone as noble as Elizabeth would mean political disaster. If the full truth came out, dozens of nobles, priests, even royal family members could be implicated for covering up, for taking bribes, for looking away. The royal solution was very clean: no public trial. Elizabeth's servants, those who carried out the torture, were tried instead. Some were tortured themselves, burned alive. Harsh sentences to set an example for the public. And Elizabeth? She was placed under house arrest in her own castle. They sealed her chamber doors, leaving only a small slit for food and air. No one was allowed to see her. No one was allowed to mention her. Elizabeth Bathe, once the most powerful woman in Central Europe, became a lonely shadow behind stone walls. 4 years, no voice, no light, only the slow decay, like cracked powder crumbling with each final breath. She died in 1614. No funeral, no grave marker, no tears. But do you know what's saddest of all? Her family, the Bathe, kept almost all their wealth. The castles, the land, the glory, all remained theirs. And the names of over 600 girls disappeared, as if they never existed. That was the greatest crime. Not the blood, not the torture, but the forgetting. We've walked through the story of Elizabeth Bathe, a mad noblewoman who believed human blood was the ultimate anti-aging serum. But you know what? There's something even more terrifying than a noble with a blade. It's a nobility with power. The European aristocracy of that era wasn't like fairy tales. They didn't just sit on thrones, dressed in velvet, dining under chandeliers. They ruled. They owned the land, the churches, the laws, and sometimes the truth. If you were a peasant in the 16th century, you had no name in the records, no right to accuse, and sometimes not even the right to die peacefully. A noble could ride into your village, point at your daughter, and say, "I need a maid." And all you could do was bow your head, not out of fear of the whip, but fear of a failed harvest, of losing your land, of the heavens no longer shielding the poor. Historians have called that European society a cold-blooded feudal system. Each class like a layer of stone, the nobles on top, the clergy just beneath, then merchants, artisans, and at the bottom, the nameless. Imagine a system where those at the top aren't tried, but merely advised quietly. A system where laws are rewritten whenever the lawmakers feel inconvenienced. Sound familiar? Now, you might be thinking, good thing we live in modern times. But think again. Back then, Elizabeth used human blood to preserve her beauty. The nobility used the poor to preserve the peace of their privilege. And now, there are still modern nobles. They don't carry the Bathe name, but they sit where power gathers. On stages, in boardrooms, in photos where ordinary people are never seen. They don't build stone castles, but they have firewalls and bodyguards. They don't need to force others to bathe in blood because they know how to make people willingly pour out sweat, tears, and sometimes their souls just to live in the glow that reflects off them. Maybe you've never thought about that as you scroll the morning news. But every celebrity protected despite scandal, every trial that drags on only to end in no charges filed, every forgotten disappearance is a gentle reminder. The nobility, though renamed, never really disappeared. A little-known fact, Many of the noble families who once protected Elizabeth still exist today. They've changed surnames, moved assets, relocated across Europe. Some even became politicians, business leaders, or patrons of the arts. And no one asks, where did that wealth come from? Modern historians still debate, should we separate the individual from their legacy? One side says, she's dead, let history rest. The other replies, number, because the victims were never allowed to truly live. Bing. The question is, if you live in a society where all the important doors are held by the same kind of people, with lineage, with networks, but with immunity, are you really living in the present or just in a softer version of Bathe's time? Sometimes, power doesn't need to shout. It only needs silence. And you know what? History has a strange habit. It loves to repeat itself. Not in obvious ways, but in ways you barely notice. Back then, it was blood. Now it's fame. Back then, it was castles. Now it's mansions named after influencers. Every era has its forgotten, and every era has its untouchables. The long-lived, the beautifully lit, the ones never asked, what did you sacrifice to shine like that? So you see, not everyone with a crown is royalty. Some wear the spotlight. Some sit at the banquet and are never spotlighted. And some, like you, lie in the dark, listening, wondering, am I sleeping in a fairy tale where the queen still lives? In Elizabeth Bathe's time, 16th century Central and Eastern Europe, beauty wasn't just about being pleasant to look at. It was a declaration, a soft weapon, living proof of power, of class, and of purity. Beauty wasn't for admiration. It was for claiming your place in the hierarchy. Imagine, in the courts, no one said, she looks sexy. They whispered, she seems crafted by God from moonlight and holy water. And the beauty standard then? Can you guess? Skin white as wax. Not pale and healthy, mind you, but pale and bluish, almost ghostly. Why? Because white skin proved you never had to work in the fields. It showed you didn't belong to the laboring class. Every suntan, every bead of sweat was an accusation. So noble women powdered their faces with lead mixed with vinegar to make their skin look like porcelain. Lead, a metal that could drive you mad but was seen as the foundation of elegance. Eyebrows had to be high, foreheads wide. Many women plucked their hairline and temples to make their forehead appear taller, as it was believed a high forehead was a sign of refined intelligence. It sounds bizarre now, but you know how it is. Every era has its beauty trends that make later generations laugh until they ache. Lips, pale, almost matching the skin. Red was seen as vulgar, promiscuous, a reminder of professions never spoken aloud. Red lipstick was only for masquerades or folk puppet shows. Body shape? Slim but not gaunt. A woman was considered beautiful if she was delicate, upright, with small hands and a walk as light as floating. If you were too full-figured, they would whisper, she looks too close to wild nature. And the hair, blonde or light brown, was the ideal. Women dyed it with chamomile water and sunbathed all day. Some used ash or sulfur powder. Of course, the hair would fall out, dry up, but as long as it shimmered even slightly gold, it was worth it. Sound familiar? A time when women endured daily discomfort just to resemble an image someone else had drawn. Not so different from today, with filters, bleaching creams, and all kinds of miracle treatments sold online. But there was one beauty standard more terrifying than the rest, and that was youth. Not because youth is always adored, but because it symbolized fertility, virginity, and purity. A young girl was seen as a treasure, not just for her looks, but because she was living proof of her family's honor. And for women like Elizabeth Bathe, as youth began to slip away, they would do anything to keep the appearance society worshipped, even if it meant blood, even if it meant lives. The nobility believed, if you were beautiful, God had chosen you. If you were ugly, you might be a witch. Yes, really. Some women were accused of witchcraft simply for having moles, dark skin, or crooked teeth. Beauty wasn't just about appearance, it was a license to exist. Modern historians still debate, did noble women of that time truly want to be beautiful, or were they just living inside an invisible prison of societal gaze? That question may still echo today, every time you see someone starving themselves just to fit into a dress they saw online. You see, beauty standards back then weren't in the mirror, they were in other people's eyes, and you had to do whatever it took not to be seen the wrong way. Today is no different. The mirror has become a camera, and the gaze now comes from millions of strangers. So tonight, when you look in the mirror one last time before sleep, don't ask, "Am I beautiful enough?" Ask instead, "Am I trying to look like someone else just because I'm afraid of not being them?" In those days, noble women didn't just stare into mirrors and wish to stay young, they acted. And sometimes, those actions were so bizarre, you can't help but feel thankful that all you need is moisturizer and 8 hours of sleep. First, skincare. No serums, no sonic facial brushes. They used things you'd now expect to find in a kitchen. Egg whites, fermented yogurt, honey, plant ash, and, are you ready? Urine. Yes, urine. Specifically from young, healthy men collected early in the morning. It was believed to cleanse evil energy and miraculously brighten the skin. Some records mention noble women dabbing their faces with urine-soaked cloths each morning. It may sound like a challenge from a survival game show, but for them, it was sacred beauty lore. And you won't believe this. Some even used bat blood dabbed onto moles with the belief that it would erase unsightly marks. Who knows if it worked? But one thing's certain, no one wanted to get too close while they were doing skincare. As for maintaining their figure, no gyms, no step counters. They bound their stomachs, not like the corsets of Victorian times, but with leather straps pulled tightly around the waist and then layered with skirts to hide any sign of a commoner's belly. Breathing deeply or eating fully mattered less than appearing slim from a distance. Some women intentionally starved themselves, not for health, but because they believed eating less keeps the face taut. The saying beauty means hunger didn't originate in modern times after all. And the hair, oh, what a tale. They washed it with dark beer or treated it with vinegar mixed with ash. The goal was to soften and preserve light color. Blonde hair was the trend. So many noble women sat under the midday sun, hair coated in a dye made from roots and sulfur. Some passed out from heat stroke. But when they awoke, the first thing they asked was, "Did my hair lighten?" But beauty alone wasn't enough. Eternal youth was the ultimate goal. And with the belief that blood contained life essence, some women began trying even more disturbing methods. Elizabeth Bathe was simply the most extreme example. But records exist of women mixing animal blood into facial masks, particularly that of young goats or white doves. And the wealthier ones? They tried drinking gold dissolved in wine, called the elixir of youth. Sounds luxurious? Yes. Sounds toxic? Also yes. Because, as you know, gold isn't exactly digestible. But in a world where youth means power, drinking precious metals seemed more reasonable than accepting a wrinkle. And then there were the rumors of magic springs, of inhaling the breath of virgins, of eating the hearts of young deer, secret rites, never confirmed, yet whispered from castle to convent. Modern historians look back on these practices and split into two camps. One sees them as evidence of pre-scientific superstition. The other says, no. They were symptoms of a desperate society that forced women to stay young or disappear. You see, beauty back then wasn't a source of pride. It was a burden. Too beautiful, and you were envied. Not beautiful enough, and you were forgotten. And if you aged, you were replaced. No one asked if you were tired. They only asked, why do you look less radiant? Sound familiar? Because today, we have modern versions of stomach binding called Photoshop. We have skin brightening formulas just bottled in glass, sold for millions. And we still have gazes that make people feel not beautiful enough to be loved. Hi. Back then, noble women didn't just sit in front of mirrors wishing to stay young. They acted. And sometimes, their actions were so strange, you almost feel grateful that all you need is moisturizer and 8 hours of sleep. Skincare came first. No serums, no ultrasonic cleansing brushes. They used things you'd now only expect to see in a kitchen. Egg whites, fermented yogurt, honey, plant ash, and, are you ready? Urine. Yes, urine. Specifically from young, healthy men, collected early in the morning. It was believed to cleanse evil energy and miraculously brighten the skin. Some records mention noble women dabbing their faces with urine-soaked cloths each morning. It may sound like a challenge from a survival game show, but for them, it was sacred beauty lore. And you won't believe this, some even used bat blood dabbed onto moles with the belief that it would erase unsightly marks. Who knows if it worked? But one thing's certain, no one wanted to get too close while they were doing skincare. As for maintaining their figure, no gyms, no step counters. They bound their stomachs. Not like the corsets of Victorian times, but with leather straps, pulled tightly around the waist, and then layered with skirts to hide any sign of a commoner's belly. Breathing deeply or eating fully mattered, less than appearing slim from a distance. So, some women intentionally starved themselves, not for health, but because they believed eating less keeps the face taut. The saying beauty means hunger didn't originate in modern times after all. When it came to hair, oh what a tale. They washed it with dark beer or treated it with ash water mixed with vinegar. The goal was to soften the hair and preserve a light color. Blonde hair was the trend. So many noble women sat under the noonday sun with their hair coated in a dye made from plant roots and sulfur. Some fainted from heat stroke. But when they woke up, the first thing they asked was, "Did my hair get lighter?" But beauty alone wasn't enough. Eternal youth was the ultimate goal. And with the belief that blood carried life essence, some women began to try more disturbing remedies. Elizabeth Bathory was merely the most extreme example. Records show others mixing animal blood into skincare masks, especially from young goats or white doves. And the wealthier? They tried drinking gold dissolved in wine, the so-called elixir of youth. Sound glamorous? Yes. Sound toxic? Also yes. Because, as you know, gold doesn't exactly digest well. But in a world where youth is power, drinking precious metals sometimes made more sense than having another wrinkle. Then came the rumors about magical springs, about inhaling a virgin's breath, about eating the hearts of baby deer. Secret rites, never confirmed, yet quietly passed from castle to convent. Modern historians look back at these customs and divide into two camps. One sees them as evidence of pre-scientific superstition. The other says, no, they were the desperate expression of a society that demanded women remain forever young or vanish. You see, beauty in those times wasn't something to be proud of. It was a burden. If you were too beautiful, you were envied. Not beautiful enough, you were forgotten. And if you aged, you were replaced. No one asked if you were tired. They only asked, why do you look less radiant? In Elizabeth Bathory's world, and more broadly, in medieval noble society, beauty was a gift wrapped in a blade. If you were a beautiful girl, you might be seen. But that came with stares, expectations, constant scrutiny. You were no longer a person. You became an aesthetic object to display, to praise, to possess. In poor rural villages, a beautiful girl might be chosen to serve in a castle, given silk dresses and exotic food. But in return, she lost her freedom. She didn't get to choose where she lived, whom she married, or even when to sigh. In noble families, beauty was a woman's capital. A beautiful young lady was seen as a ticket to lucrative marriage alliances. You're beautiful? Wonderful. Then you'll be married off to a powerful uncle 3 times your age, so your parents can keep their land. No love, no freedom, but you'll wear the finest wedding gown in town. To Elizabeth Bathory, obsessed with youth and beauty, the prettiest girls didn't get treated better. They suffered worse, because she believed the more beautiful, the more pure, the blood. The younger, the smoother the skin. The more perfect, the more worthy of sacrifice. Imagine, among the hundreds of girls brought into that castle, the most beautiful were the first to be noticed. They were kept longer, given special treatment, and then they vanished, especially. That is the tragic paradox. Beauty might save you from poverty, but it won't save you from death. Scattered accounts claim that Elizabeth had a particular preference for girls with light hair, pale skin, and large eyes. Some servants said she didn't kill them right away, but kept them around, used gradually. Cold, calculated, almost collected. You see now, beauty without power is just something that makes you easier to choose as prey. And in the larger society, of course, beautiful girls were invited to parties, noticed by princes, showered with gifts. But they were also easy targets for jealousy, quick to be accused of witchcraft, and the first to be sacrificed when something went wrong. She seduced my husband. She bewitched the count. She cast spells with her beauty. Beauty was a ticket to the ball, but you never got to choose the music. Modern scholars still debate. Did women back then really want to be beautiful? Or were they simply following a script, one where no one ever asked if they wanted to be on stage at all? You're still lying there, aren't you? Your eyes growing heavy. And I'm still whispering, this time, about the ones no one mentions in the history books, but who were the true foundation of the medieval world, the peasants. No crowns, no silk, no blood baths or bizarre beauty rituals. Just calloused hands, bent backs from carrying water, and eyes always lowered when nobles rode past. If you were born a peasant in the 16th century, you had no surname, no rights, no choices. Your life was decided the moment you arrived in it. And most of the time, you lived as if repaying a debt you never incurred. You lived in a hut with a thatched roof, walls of mud and straw, and a single room where the whole family slept, cooked, and, if needed, gave birth. No bed, just dry straw on the floor. And in winter, you didn't sleep, you curled up, shivered, and prayed there were still enough living bodies come morning to light the fire. Peasants didn't own land. They rented the very soil they farmed, paying for it by giving nearly all their harvest to the Lord. If the year was good, they survived. If the year failed, they starved. And if the whole village starved, it was God's will, not the fault of anyone in power. You paid taxes, not just one, but many. Crop taxes, marriage taxes, birth taxes, taxes to use the castle's mill, even taxes to be buried in the village cemetery. What about peasant women? They rose before dawn, fetched water, chopped wood, mended clothes, worked fields, raised children, cooked meals, delivered neighbors' babies, and still were called ignorant if they didn't know how to embroider. Some birthed 10 children, buried 7, and people still said, that's normal. 1. Peasant girls, especially those with decent looks, lived in one of 2 states, either ignored or chosen, and not chosen for opportunity, but for service. One day, the Lord's men came to the village and pointed, that one. And just like that, you were taken to clean, cook, care for horses, or worse. Your parents might cry, but could do nothing, because to object was to oppose God, and God stood with the riders. Some peasants tried to rise up, forming secret groups, hiding weapons, gathering in the forest. But nearly all were caught, hanged in the village square, living reminders, never forget your place on the ladder. And strangely, despite it all, they still sang, still told stories around the fire, still laughed when a cow gave birth to a bull calf. They lived, not because they hoped to be noble someday, but because surviving until the next season was a victory in itself. History rarely records their names, but if you look closely, every grand castle, every royal wedding, every celebrated war stood on the shoulders of those no one remembers. They built the walls, reaped the grain, forged the swords, and raised the stage for the upper class to perform. So when you hear tales of Elizabeth Bathory or any other noble figure, don't just look at their robes or titles. Ask, who washed their clothes? Who lost their child so they could keep their youth? Who fell without a name and without anyone to mourn them? You see, peasants had no castles, but they had something those in power often lacked: truth. And though their voices didn't echo through the pages of history, they still whispered through every harvest, every unmarked grave, and through stories like this one, told in the dark to someone listening like you. In Elizabeth Bathory's time, and really, for centuries across Europe, society wasn't divided between good and evil. It was divided between the powerful and everyone else. It was a world where justice didn't live in the hands of the law, but in the hands of those with land, family crests, or ties to the church. If you were a noble, you could kill and be praised for righteous punishment. If you were a peasant and stole a loaf of bread, you could be hanged in the town square, a public lesson carved in flesh. You might think the greatest injustice was the gap between rich and poor, but it wasn't. The greatest injustice was this: not everyone was considered human. Nobles had names, had heraldry, had seats in the cathedral. Peasants? They were recorded in tax books, but not in prayers. They died of disease, but only a lord's illness brought a doctor to the door in the dead of night. There are stories of noble soldiers attacking village women. Everyone knew, the parents knew, the villagers knew, but no one dared to speak. No one dared to accuse. Because who would you accuse? The very man who'd sign your death sentence if you resisted. Even in the church, supposedly a place of fairness and holiness, injustice bled through. Village priests were paid by the lords. They preached virtue but dined nightly at noble tables. Even baptisms and weddings had a price. And burials? If you were poor, you were buried at the edge of the cemetery, where the ground hadn't been blessed. Some historians call it a two-heaven society. One high above, where nobles lived, loved, sinned, and were forgiven. And one below, where common folk breathed, endured, and were forgotten. You could see this injustice everywhere. In how laws applied only to the poor. In how noble children learned Latin, while peasant children didn't even learn their own names. In how a murderer of hundreds could live out her life in her own castle, while a hungry child who stole an apple might die in a dungeon. You ask, did no one resist? Of course they did. There were peasant uprisings, from Germany to France, from Hungary to England. But they almost always ended in blood. Because sticks don't beat steel. Rage doesn't beat cavalry. And the bitter truth is, history is written by survivors, and survivors are usually the powerful. But you know what's strange? Despite the injustice, people still lived. They had children, hummed lullabies, built homes, carved their stories into stone, into wind, into whispers, because they knew this. True justice might not come from courts, but it lives in memory, in retelling, in remembrance. And that's why you're hearing this story tonight. Elizabeth Bathe thought she could bury it all. The blood, the victims, the crimes. But no, she could buy the silence of priests, of judges, but she couldn't buy time. Injustice can win in one lifetime, but not forever. In Elizabeth Bathe's time, and for centuries before, the law wasn't what it is today. It wasn't meant for rehabilitation, but for public fear. The goal wasn't to help you change, it was to make others afraid to try. And you know what? When a society believes pain is the best tool to maintain order, cruel punishment becomes ordinary. If you were a peasant and stole a loaf of bread, you might lose a hand. If you insulted a noble by accident, they might slit your mouth to help you speak more clearly next time. And if you were a woman accused of witchcraft, oh, the list of punishments for you was as long as a mourning shroud. One common method was public punishment in the town square. The accused would be tied to a stone post where people could throw tomatoes, rotten eggs, or worse, sharp stones, animal dung. The goal wasn't just to hurt you, it was to humiliate you. Because shame, in their minds, was what would keep you from doing it again. There was a device called the witch's chair, a metal seat heated with coal, where the condemned would sit as the crowd cheered. You stayed there until your flesh burned, sometimes until death. No evidence needed, just an accusation. There were cages hung in public squares, where the accused would be suspended high up, naked, exposed to sun, rain, and contemptuous stares until they collapsed from hunger or cold. A punishment without blood, but one that broke a person from the inside out. And if the crime was greater, you might earn the honor of being drawn and quartered, your body cut into 4 parts, dragged across the land as a warning. Sometimes the head was mounted on a city gate, hands and feet sent to other villages, a message with no need for words. Those who oppose power will vanish. As for heresy, that was the highest crime. If you were accused of offending the church, you might be burned alive at the stake. The fire wasn't just a physical death, but a purification ritual, because they believed your soul needed to be scorched clean. Sounds like redemption? But in truth, it was death in agony, bound before a screaming crowd, the smell of burning hair filling the square. Modern historians still argue, were these punishments really about protecting society, or just a way to uphold power through fear? Some documents reveal that many lords used the law as a personal weapon. Want someone's land? Accuse them of heresy. Want another man's wife? Declare her husband a dissenter. You could live your whole life obediently, but one false accusation, one ill-timed glance, and you'd become a cautionary tale. What they called justice was sometimes as fragile as the ego of those in charge. And you know the saddest part? The crowd always showed up, always shouted, always clapped when the executioner raised the axe, not because they were evil, but because they were taught it was right. That watching someone else suffer was how you learned to be good. Sound familiar? When someone is publicly dealt with online, and people rush into the comments as if another person's pain is a kind of entertainment. Maybe there are no more whips, no more stakes, but the crowd's nature sometimes still feels the same. So, you see, punishment back then wasn't just aimed at the body, it was aimed at silence. When you know you can be torn apart for saying the wrong word, you stop speaking, and that's when power wins. In a world where most of the population was illiterate, the church was the only one who could read the voice of God. And if you didn't listen, you weren't just a non-believer, you were a threat. Imagine a child born, raised, and buried, knowing only one faith, Catholicism. No choice, no questions, only the church, the Mass, and the fear. Not fear of God, but fear of not pleasing those who claim to speak for him. Priests were among the rare, educated few. They had the power to baptize, forgive, marry, bury, and accuse. If you were branded a heretic, meaning you didn't believe the right way, didn't live the right way, didn't pray at the right time, you could be arrested, interrogated, burned, or disappeared without a trace. And no one would dare ask why. Religion back then didn't just exist inside the church. It was the church. It was the school, the clinic, the administration, the judge of life and death for an entire community. You're sick, they give you holy water. You're poor, they tell you suffering is the reward of the righteous. You're robbed, they say pray for the thief. And if you ask, why do the rich live in comfort? They reply, because God is testing you. There's a strange truth few mention. Religion in those times was both a refuge and the most dangerous place to be. People believed in God, no doubt. But those who claimed to speak for God sometimes used that belief as a chain. Elizabeth Bathe was a vivid example. Even as hundreds of girls vanished around her castle, priests turned a blind eye. Why? Because she donated money, built chapels, funded monasteries. And in a world where the church bells rang louder than the cries of the poor, gold always had the final word. Some priests even blessed rituals they dared not investigate too closely. One account describes a priest visiting Elizabeth's castle, accepting gifts, feasting, even though just days before, a girl had disappeared in the woodshed. Modern historians still debate, was the church completely corrupted? Some say yes. Others argue, you can't condemn the whole system for a few individuals. But everyone agrees on one thing. The union of religion and secular power made justice far from sacred. Do you know the cruelest irony? Among the hundreds of victims burned as witches, most were poor women, widows, or simply a bit odd. These women harmed no one. They just didn't fit the mold of a proper godly woman. And so they were accused. No proof. Just a whisper was enough to light the stake. You see it now. A religion meant to bring hope and light was once bent into a weapon of suppression. The faith wasn't wrong, but the people representing it were often the reason others lost theirs. So tonight, as you lie there, no one forcing you to pray, no one demanding you kneel in the right direction, no one burning you alive for not understanding a verse. Take a deep breath, because the freedom of belief you now have once cost countless lives. In the Middle Ages, society was layered like a towering wedding cake. The top was royalty, who decided the fate of nations. Below them, the nobility who owned land, castles, servants, and private prisons. Then came the clergy, monks, bishops, cardinals, supposedly close to God, yet often closer to the throne than the people. And at the bottom were all the rest. The peasants, the blacksmiths, the weavers, the children born already in debt to a legacy they never chose. In that world, status wasn't earned through talent or virtue. It came from blood. And if you were born into the wrong layer, no matter how brilliant you were, your life would be spent bowing your head. You could save a life, but if you were a peasant, you wouldn't be called a hero. You could commit crimes, but if you were a noble, you might be called spirited. A drunken noble who beat others and stole land was said to have a strong temperament. A peasant who demanded justice was hanged without trial. Injustice wasn't just in the law. It was in the way people had become so used to it, they believed it was natural. And what about women? No one was more clearly placed to feel that injustice. Born female, you were not allowed to study, not allowed to own property, not allowed to choose your marriage. You were a gift, passed in family alliances. A white dress could not hide the truth that you never chose your life. Some women were smarter than their husbands, yet had to pretend to be foolish. Some mothers lost their children to noble houses and were expected to give thanks for being noticed. Sounds bitter, doesn't it? But it was reality. And if you were a child, well, there were no children's rights. You were labor, a tool, a stomach to feed, and a pair of hands to work. A poor child who got sick, pray if you still had strength. Medicine was for the privileged. And if you died, just another name blown away by wind. No record, no remembrance. There's a sad tale once told. In a village, 10 girls disappeared after being sent to serve the countess. Their parents went to the church and begged the priest to intervene. But the priest quietly replied, "You should not question the will of God." And they walked away, empty-handed, eyes red, believing that somehow their daughters had done something wrong. When injustice wears holy robes, it becomes untouchable. And that is the most perfect kind of injustice. Today, you might think, we've come a long way. And yes, we have, but you still see the rich break the law and be called reckless. The poor break the law and are labeled uneducated. You still see the powerful speak out and be praised as bold, while those with no voice who speak out are branded rebellious, difficult, in need of correction. Injustice never vanished, it just changed costumes. Instead of whips, it uses public opinion. Instead of gallows, it posts online. Instead of physical torture, it inflicts silence by ignoring the cries of those not famous enough to be defended. We've talked about punishments, about the church, about injustice. But if you had to choose one word to capture daily life for the common people of that era, it would be misery. Not tragedy, not heroism. Just misery, quiet, persistent, and without exit. The people lived by the land and died because of it. A small patch of field, a skinny cow, one bad harvest, enough to determine whether the family lived or starved that year. Each day, you rose before dawn. No alarm clocks, only the sound of an empty stomach, a rooster's cry, the wind sneaking through straw walls. You tied up your torn shirt, grabbed the last bit of dry bread, and went to the fields. You dug, reaped, led oxen, mended nets, chopped wood. And you did all this knowing most of what you produced would not be yours. Most of the crops went to the landlord, a portion to the church, another to trade for salt, oil, coarse cloth. What remained, just enough to live if the weather didn't betray you. Each failed harvest was a year of hell. Children grew thin. Couples argued over scraps of porridge. The elderly could only lie still and wait. No nursing homes, no hospitals. No one asked, "How are you feeling today?" Toothache? Pull it. Fever? Pray. Broken leg? You lay there, cared for if someone chose to. If not, left to fate. Pregnant women still hauled water. Each birth was a gamble with death. No doctors, only the village midwife, with bare hands, old cloth, and a few herbs. If the mother survived, the child had a chance. If the mother died, then she was buried behind the house, grass laid over her, and life went on as if nothing had happened. And the children? They had no childhood. They were little adults, working, helping, gathering wood, watching siblings, learning to survive. No one asked what they dreamed of. No one asked what they wanted to become. They only knew. To live, you had to work. That's it. And so life repeated, like a rotting wooden wheel rolling endlessly on a dirt path soaked with tears. You see it now. Misery back then wasn't a sudden tragedy. It was a slow, grinding hunger, the musty smell in the corner of the house, the constant cough that was never treated, a mother's eyes watching her child, unsure what tomorrow's meal would be. And worst of all, resignation. People didn't resist because they were foolish, but because they had been taught generation after generation that this is God's will. We were born to serve. Don't dream too high lest you fall too hard. Sound familiar? Today, we might call it humility lessons or tradition. But for centuries, it was how misery was legalized and renamed as if it were something noble. And then, when someone like Elizabeth Bathe appeared, someone with all the power, all the wealth, the church at her back, that misery didn't disappear. It was exploited. The girls taken by her, no one dared to ask. No one dared to cry too loudly. Because they were used to loss. Used to being unheard. Used to feeling like the surplus of society. You lie there, in peaceful darkness, free to breathe, free to dream. And maybe you're hearing these words not just with your ears, but with your heart. Because in every sigh from those long ago, something still wants to be told. Not for pity, but as a reminder. We have passed through suffering and silence and forgetting. You've heard about nobles, heard about peasants, but slaves? They weren't on the social ladder, because they weren't counted as people. If you were a slave in 16th century Europe, you were property, like a cow, a hoe, a water bucket. You had no legal name, no homeland, no right to say no. You could be sold, lent out, gifted, or traded for a strong horse, and no one thought it strange. Slaves were everywhere, not just in dungeons, not just on warships or in forges, but in wealthy households, in castles cold as bone, beneath floors where footsteps never echoed down. In Hungary, Poland, Germany, even England, the slave class was woven into every breath of the economy. They carried grain, dug mines, served food, cooked, tended horses, cleaned, midwifed, and were kicked out like dogs for dropping a spoon. And the women? Called into their masters' rooms at night. No one asked consent. No one called it rape. If they got pregnant, they were cast out. If the child survived, it became a second-generation slave. Some were born into bondage because their parents were prisoners, debt-bound peasants, or members of conquered tribes. They grew up never knowing freedom, never dared look a master in the eye, never dared to dream of owning anything, not even the clothes on their back. But they fought back, not with swords, not with written petitions, but in ways so small that history once chose to overlook them. Some ran, alone through deep forests, starving, sleeping in the rain, evading hunting dogs, just to live one day without commands. Some faked their deaths, buried themselves in straw, then fled to monasteries, hoping the monks wouldn't send them back. Others used their minds, learned to read in secret, memorized roads, taught their children how to disappear, passed messages through loaves of bread, etched symbols into wooden beams, tapped signals after dark, silent languages to say, "We are still alive." There were uprisings too, small but fierce as sparks in winter night. On estates in Bohemia, slaves once poisoned the master's kitchen and fled en masse. In Poland, one took up a hoe and stormed the overseer's tent, not to gain power, but to die standing, not live kneeling. And strangely enough, some of those movements left marks. There were times when nobles had to hire guards just to watch their household slaves, had to forbid them from speaking to visitors, had to rewrite laws, forcing them to wear identifying badges, as if fearing the ghost of rebellion would spread everywhere. Modern historians, as they flip through the brittle scraps of parchment buried in monastic archives, sometimes stumble upon trembling, ink-smudged notations. Someone escaped last night, took a child, direction unknown, left nothing behind. A short line, yet within it, a vast longing. The desire to live as a human being. You see now, even stripped of everything, called walking tools, erased from family trees, they did not completely surrender. Because even when your voice is taken, the heart can still whisper, "I deserve more than this." Slavery didn't begin in medieval Europe. It didn't begin with Elizabeth Bathory. It didn't begin with the emperors. Slavery, at least as humanity understands it, began the moment people learned to build power upon the flesh of others. Around 4000 BCE, in ancient Mesopotamia, where the very concept of city was first born, records already speak of slaves. On clay tablets, in cuneiform script, are accounts of people captured in war, sold for debts, or born into service. That is to say, slavery existed before the pyramids, before Abraham in the Bible, before the first chapters of what mainstream history ever chose to remember. In ancient Egypt, the great monuments like the Giza Pyramid were long believed to be built by slaves. While some later scholars argue these were paid workers, the existence of a class of enslaved laborers working under brutal, inhumane conditions is still well documented. They had no freedom, no future. In ancient Greece, hailed as the cradle of democracy and philosophy, slavery was everywhere. Philosophers like Aristotle once claimed that some people were slaves by nature, as though it were the natural order. In Athens, 1 out of every 3 people was a slave. They worked in silver mines, kitchens, or even as tutors to children, without any citizenship, any rights. In Rome, where the empire stretched across Europe, slavery wasn't just common, it was the backbone of the economy. Romans measured wealth by the number of slaves they owned. Slaves harvested grapes, pressed wine, drove carriages, bathed their masters, even read aloud to lull them to sleep. If a slave rebelled, they could be beaten to death without consequence. They were property, like a chair or a jug, broken, discarded. And when the Roman Empire collapsed and religion rose in its place, you'd hope that compassion would finally lift the crushed. It didn't. Early Christianity preached mercy, yet still legalized slavery, so long as masters were kind and slaves were obedient. The church did not abolish slavery. It merely wrapped it in moral language. And then came the medieval era. And you might think the world had grown more civil. But slavery endured, simply under new names. Some places called it serfdom. Others called it religious servitude. Some branded it lifetime contracted labor. But the essence? Still the same. A human being not allowed to own their own body or life. Modern historians still debate. Should we distinguish ancient slavery from modern slavery? Is there a line between slavery and extreme labor exploitation? But no matter what you call it, the pain of being treated as an object that is a shared sorrow, from Babylon to Budapest, from Egypt to the Americas. And you know the saddest part? Slavery never truly disappeared. We just gave it gentler names. So when you ask, from which century did slavery begin? I will whisper this answer. From the moment humans realized they could build towers out of other people instead of stone. And it hasn't ended. Not entirely. And then, when Elizabeth Bathe died, people thought everything had ended. But you know what? Stories like this don't die. They rot, then seep into the earth. Roots absorb them. The next bloodline born on that very soil carries something unnamed, an untold memory, a scream that never echoed, a lesson survivors were too afraid to teach their children for fear it might happen again. The castle where she once lived was sealed, then changed owners. Some proposed turning it into a nursing home, others suggested a museum. But each night, guards still said, someone's crying in the cellar, a thin, lingering sound, like wind, but it seeps into your bones. Some say it's a ghost, but perhaps it's just longing from those never allowed to become memory. Centuries later, locals still avoid mentioning her name. Children aren't told bedtime stories about the noblewoman who bathed in blood. Regional histories teach of victories, of kings, but not of missing girls. Medieval maps are filled with castles, fortresses, churches, but blank where the screaming once echoed. Because silence, like death, can be inherited. And the painful truth is, in the end, Elizabeth is still called Countess. Still a powerful woman, still a legendary lady, even though nothing she did deserved any of those titles. And the girls? No names on tombstones, no portraits, no biographies, no statues. They left behind no story except the dried blood on old stone. Some modern historians tried to redeem Elizabeth, suggesting perhaps she was falsely accused, that powerful women of that time were often slandered. But they forgot. The ones most slandered of all were not her, but the victims. Those who were never even given the right to be defended. You see? The greatest crime isn't the blood, it's the whitewashing. When history becomes a story, people choose which parts to keep and which to forget. The question is, what are we choosing to retell? And what are we choosing to forget? But then, there are those who do not accept silence as the ending. They are the historians, sifting through moldy papers in libraries no one else visits. They are writers, poets, filmmakers who don't write about the throne, but about the ones kneeling beneath it. They trace the stray names in church records, the scribbled margins of tax books, the whispered stories shared between old women in villages. And they ask, who was she? What did she dream of before she was taken to that castle? If she had lived, what would she have told her daughter? From those questions, a return began, not for Elizabeth Bathe, but for those who were never allowed to speak. Some contemporary female historians, when writing about the Bathe case, no longer called it a bloody legend, but a history of disappearance. They didn't focus on the Countess's actions, but on the system that protected her and pushed hundreds of girls into nameless oblivion. There were writers who reimagined the victims not as corpses in an investigation file, but as young girls, one who loved to sing, one who once knit a scarf for her little brother, one who dreamed of going to the city to learn to read. They weren't. Victim number 146. They were Anna, Zizvia, Margit. And the miracle is, once you call someone by their name, they begin to exist again. In a museum in Slovakia, near the ruins of Sagete Castle. There was once a small exhibition, The Girls Who Never Returned. No portraits of Elizabeth, no torture devices, only dresses reconstructed from the 16th century, hanging silently, unworn. Beneath them were assumed names, places of origin, estimated ages, a small candle, a quote from a mother's letter, a lullaby with no voice to sing it. No one spoke loudly in that room. No one laughed. There was only listening, and that was what had been denied for centuries. You see, women today are not just reclaiming the right to live, but the right to narrate. They tell history not just from the throne, but from the hearth, from the birthing room, from the calluses their mothers left on their hems. They rewrite stories that were once reserved for nobles alone. They make films, create podcasts, write plays, open classrooms, not to speak over, but to listen. They say, if they had no voice, then we will become the echo for them. And that is how the nameless women begin to return. Not in flesh, but in collective memory, in the recognition that they were once human and deserve to be remembered as such. And now, as the night sinks deeper and you're still lying there listening, I just want to whisper one final thing. Not everyone gets the chance to tell their story. Not everyone is believed to have existed. And not every loss makes it into the history books. But if you've listened this far, if your heart still lingers in the rustle of wind, in the murmur of untold memories, then please remember, we inherit not just the light, we inherit the duty to protect the darkness, to keep it from being whitewashed, to keep those swallowed by silence from vanishing a second time. Elizabeth Bathe is dead, but the system that created her, still here in different forms. The castles now wear brand names. The whips take the shape of public opinion, the cellars are named boardrooms, and the girls who go unheard remain countless. So tonight, when you look at yourself in the mirror one last time, don't just ask, how do I look? Ask instead, who am I living for? And is there someone out there still waiting to be heard? Thank you for staying with me to the very end of this journey. If this story left you in silence, if your heart skipped a beat, then it was not told in vain. Wishing you a peaceful night and a memory that does not sleep.